Hey everyone, I'm Robert Mann. Today I want to talk through what might be a standard list of drawings for a development application for a new build or maybe an alteration and addition. So, when we have a DA process, what sort of documentation do we need? Firstly, we need architectural plans, plans that explain, identify the scope of the design. If it's a new house, that's explaining the position of the house on the site. Maybe if it's a knockdown rebuild, that's explaining the position of the existing house to be demolished and the position of the new house on the site. If it's an alteration and addition, then maybe it's explaining the condition or the siting or the size of the current house, and then clearly explaining the relationship between that existing component and whatever's new and proposed. This is going to be the architectural drawings that are included in the package that's sent to council for approval. And then after that, we'll talk about the additional things that may be needed, such as reports that accompany the architectural plans. When we're describing or setting up a set of architectural plans, we want to think of it like telling a story. So we want to start with a overall picture or a larger scale and then work in towards more detail. So the first drawing that we may have a title page. That title page might have a cover picture. That might be a beautiful render, a perspective, trying to explain the quality or the intent of the design in a very practical, easy to understand way. That might be a picture of a model if a model has been built, or maybe it's a digital model. Or it may be a location plan where we're zoomed all the way out to understand the position of the site in relationship to the community or city or ocean or wherever it's positioned. We then zoom in a little, and so we're now seeing the whole site. And so this will be the site plan. Now the site plan may also show other information. Most importantly, that's going to show the house on its site, on that block of land. Now, if that block of land is very, very large, we may again need to split this up into two drawings. So we might have a location plan or an overall site plan, and then we might have a detailed site plan. What we're really trying to communicate is where exactly is that house or the addition, the proposed work, located on that site. Or another way of saying that would be, what is the boundary offsets? How close is it to the street boundary? How close is it to the side boundary, or what's the relationship between those things? On a very large site, this is slightly less important. On a very small site, this is much more critical. And of course, depending on the site, we may have different legal requirements about how far away we need to be set back. We may need to be set back consistently with neighbours, so therefore it's really important to show the neighbouring setbacks, or we may just want to be a long way away from the neighbours in order to not create problems with privacy or overshadowing. On that site plan, we may also have notes to show BASICs, Building Assessment Sustainability Index. So we don't need to show the BASICs assessment on the plan, but we need to show the BASICs commitments on the plan. So whatever is required in the BASICs assessment, we then need to somehow communicate that on the plans. Now, the rules are a little bit vague as to how those commitments need to be described. So it could just be a list, or it could be represented, it could be numbered. It doesn't really matter. And I've done this a few different ways on different projects, and I've never had a problem with a certifier not being able to understand the way that the BASICs is being communicated. If it's a complicated project, then beyond the BASICs requirements, we also may have NatHERS requirements. NatHERS stands for National Housing Energy Rating Scheme. And again, if it's a big building or a complicated building, we may not be able to get the BASICs approved as a DIY method. So it may need to be more a performance assessment. That assessment might be done in a few different ways, and that's going to show more detail about the way that the heating and cooling loads are calculated. So again, that information may need to be communicated on the site plan. The site plan may also show the areas or the division of space. So on the site, what's the calculations for the landscape? What's the calculation for the site coverage, or for the gross floor area, or the roof area? So depending on the council requirements, we may need to show a variety of these. Some councils won't measure gross floor area or floor space ratio, some will. Some may call it built upon area or unbuilt area. We may also use the site plan to represent the sediment and erosion control requirements, showing where we're going to have sediment fences or gates or barriers in order to preserve the natural environment during construction so that we don't have sediment washing across the site into neighbouring properties or maybe into nature reserves. In terms of thinking about that scale of representation, we don't have a hard and fast rule of the order of how things go, but generally I want the first lot of plans to represent the whole site and explain the site in relationship. So the next drawings that we may use in a set of architectural plans might be shadow diagrams. It might be describing how the shadows are cast from the proposed project to the neighbouring developments. Now, this has changed in its requirements over the last few years, and councils have their own rules about what they need to show. Critically, it's only important to show that we're providing enough sun when there's not much available during winter. So now we tend to only need to show those winter requirements. And that might normally be conveyed as 3 times 9 a.m., noon, midday, and 3 p.m. And that's going to be on winter solstice, so the shortest day of the year. Typically, in Australia at least, that's going to be June the 21st, maybe the 22nd, maybe the 23rd. It changes annually slightly. We may also have site analysis drawings that we need to show. Site analysis may show how the house interacts with the site in an environmental way, or maybe in a neighbourhood way. It might be talking about views, it might be talking about sun access or solar access to the house instead of just the shadow casting from the house to the neighbouring properties. The site analysis plan might also look at the natural build-up of vegetation, not just on the site, but maybe in the neighbouring area, and how that affects the design or the performance of the design in the proposed project. Once we're through the site drawings, we may then be looking at the floor plans. So a floor plan is a horizontal sectional cut through the building, taken at each story, if it's a multi-story building, explaining what the inside of the house looks like. A roof plan is where we're viewing the building from on top, like a bird's eye view, seeing what the roof would look like, what's the shape of the building, what's the materiality of the roof, is there skylights, and we generally will also be showing a outline, a dashed outline of the exterior envelope of the building below, or the outside of the walls, to explain the relationship between the roof and the walls. We also need to explain the design through sections. So a section is a vertical cut through the building, and that's generally going to be cut in 2 different directions at least to explain how the building relates to the site and how the building stories relate to one another and how that roof relates to the stories. An external elevation or external elevations are also required as part of the DA, and that's explaining the relationship as viewed from the outside of the face of the building. The technical term for this is an orthographic view, and basically that means it's a flat view. So it's not what we'd see with our eye, which would be a perspective, but it's a flat view viewed from the front, the sides, and the back, explaining what the exterior face of that house would look like. Now, depending on the council requirements, that may need to be coloured. In addition to all these other drawings, we may also need to show some schedules. Typically for DA, we need to convey some information about the doors and windows. But we need to at least give enough information to explain the DA requirements of the doors and windows. Now, this is already achieved partly through the BASICs or through the NatHERS assessment. The door and window schedule therefore is validating that or maybe providing that relevant information. And then finally, we're going to need to show external finishes. I typically will call that a material schedule. Council is very interested in the exterior finishes or materials that we're proposing in the project. The exterior materials may be the wall finishes, the roof finishes, maybe external floor finishes. Now, this could go further and show internal finishes as well, but it's technically not necessary as part of the DA process. In addition to the plans, we will also have a variety of reports that are necessary. These reports may be provided by the architect, or they may be provided by external consultants who are specialists in their own field. Landscape design might be a component of the approval process. Interior design may not be part of the DA requirement, but of course the interior design may affect, particularly if it's spatial design, the design outcome, and therefore we'd want to have all of our designing resolved before we go to DA process, especially if it might be a long process to get approved, as well as being expensive. We don't want to have to do it twice if we can help it. BASIX, or BASIX, B-A-S-I-X, is the state government requirement for sustainability that's assessed as part of that DA or CDC process. Now this is looking at 3 components. We'll cover this in more detail later, but it's assessing the building on its use of water, its use of electricity or consumption, and its thermal performance. And of course, if we think about how is a building thermally controlled, generally the way that we'd heat or cool a building would be with electricity or gas. So really, generally speaking, it comes back to consumption of energy. In addition to this, we need a statement of environmental effects. This is explaining how the design relates to the site, relates to the neighbourhood, and effectively meets all of the conditions imposed in the DCP and LEP. This is validating the design, showing that the design meets the criteria. And this effectively allows the planner to confirm the legislation against the design and show where it meets. Now, it's important that this is accurate and consistent. It's not trying to gloss over problems, it's identifying where there are any differences or conditions that haven't been met, and it might be justifying why we weren't able to meet that condition. So let's say that the LEP imposes a building height regulation, a maximum building height. But the site is very complicated, and based on the steepness of the site, in some locations, maybe it's very difficult to meet that building height limit. And so a variation might need to be created in conjunction with the statement of environmental effects. This could be done by the architect, or this could be done by a town planner, explaining the need for that variation or the justification for it. One of the other requirements of a DA would be to explain how stormwater is managed on the site. We may also need to have an engineer involved in the design of the driveway. A waste management report is designed to minimize the amount of waste that's produced. That waste can be broken into 3 categories: reused on site, recycled, or disposed of. When we're disposing of it during construction, we can't just put it into council's bin. This will normally mean that it needs to be contracted out. So the waste management report will explain who the contractors for this process are. The tricky part about this is that each builder may have their own specific preferred contractors. So who does the waste management report? Is it done by the architect, or is it done by the builder who's working in the process? So it really just depends on maybe when the builder is engaged. Does the builder become involved with the DA process, or is the builder not chosen until much later? One of the other report requirements is a QS report. The QS may provide a cost summary report. This is describing an estimate of the pricing to be used at DA level. It's quite typical that the pricing that's provided at DA will determine the fees for the DA. And even though this is sometimes a little bit ambiguous and may not be able to be confirmed exactly until much further down the track, once construction documentation has been completed and tenders have gone out to builders to provide prices for the actual construction of the project, the council still require this information up front. This could therefore be provided by an architect or by a builder, but a lot of councils will have a requirement that once the building is over a certain cost value, then this must be done by a quantity surveyor. Of course, having a quantity surveyor do this is beneficial anyway, as this information may be more reliable, as this is the role of a quantity surveyor to calculate costs, and this information could then be used by a builder in helping to validate their pricing, maybe done in a preliminary way, to ensure that the quantities that they're basing it off are also shown in the quantity surveyor's report. Now please note that depending on which council you're in, or which method of approval you're working towards, the requirements of these drawings will change. And the drawings that we've talked about today are really only for this first stage of planning approval, not necessarily a CDC or a CC, which may require an extra level of complexity. And of course, this type of documentation is not appropriate for construction. Or another way of saying that is we should never use DA drawings or even CC drawings for construction when produced by an architect unless explicitly stated that it should be used for construction. For construction documentation will typically be much more developed and much more detailed, providing all of the information that's necessary in order to make sure a building gets built correctly, and will also include all of the structural engineering requirements that has been coordinated by the architect with the engineering team, as well as any other services that are required.